Hi, Mage fans. Quick note before we start this week's show. This episode is in two parts. The first is our Tomes of Magic discussion between Adam and I on the M20 Quickstart, which we sometimes refer to as the Kickstart, not to be confused with Lore of the Traditions currently available on Kickstarter. This was given out during Free RPG Day and is a wonderful quick reference to M20. Link to get your copy is in the show notes. At about the 35-minute mark, we transition to listener questions from Adam and mine read-through of Revised. These are the Tomes of Magic specific questions that we got during our end-of-year Q&A that I did with Josh Heath. Also, thank you to everyone who's joined us during the Lore of the Traditions Kickstarter. Adam and I record Tomes of Magic episodes like this one generally between 3 and 6 weeks ahead of time, so if you recently started supporting our show on Patreon at patreon.com/matesthepodcast, thank you. You may not hear your name at the end of this episode, but you should for our next regular one. Also a reminder, 1D4Con is happening online the weekend March 4th to 6th. Run a game, play a game, buy a game, all online. Links to that are in the show notes. And with that, on with the show.
Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson, and today on Tomes of Magic, we are going to be discussing the Mage 20 Kickstart. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment and give some personal words from my own point of view. Now that Tomes of Magic is beginning the books of Mage 20, the game's 4th edition, I'd like to pull back the curtain for a moment and speak plainly about my intentions as a host. I speak only for myself, not for Terry or Mage the podcast. As we spoke on the books of Revised Edition, there were a number of things that caught my attention, but I did not discuss in our episodes. Revised Edition was not my favorite edition, but I knew that it is for many of our listeners. Because of this, I thought of myself as a guest in someone else's house. I tried to focus on the positive for the most part, but still called attention to things that I thought could cause problems at some game tables. Mage 20 is an edition for all Mage fans, and since I've been a Mage fan since the start, going forward, I will take the attitude that I'm in my own house. Now, this isn't going to be a radical transformation for me as a host, but what I wanted to say was I just intend to speak a little more freely about things that I notice as I'm going through the books. I think this podcast serves its listeners best when the hosts and guests are free to speak their minds. As a host, I will avoid insulting or making fun of individuals or real groups of people. Adding a little humor to the episodes entertains the listeners, but all humor runs the risk of offending someone. I may try to get a laugh describing how much I dislike something in a book, but I want to be clear that I will not be running down any of the authors. We can dislike what an author has written without disliking the author. I don't know any of the Mage 20 authors and have nothing against any of them. A while back, a former Mage author stated the hosts of this podcast should be aware that World of Darkness authors may be listening to our episodes. I take these words seriously and don't want to diss the people that work so hard to produce content for the game I love. However, I reserve the right to share my opinions on the books. If someone mistakes my comments on Mage material as a personal put-down, that is unfortunate, but it was never my goal. If my comments offend a Mage 20 author or a listener, I would mention two things. First, please remember this disclaimer. And second, in a game about conflicting paradigms, please be open to the possibility that the person who has offended you may have a paradigm quite different from your own. Okay, well, with that out of the way, I just wanted to open this up for announcements before we get this episode underway. Terry, were there any announcements for us?
I would first like to say that I think your disclaimer is entirely reasonable, and as someone who at this point has now written for M20, I largely agree with you. We never do anything with an intent to offend. There are things that we try and differentiate between things that we think are bad writing and things that we think are maybe not the best table experience. None of these are an intention of putting down or slamming the authors. In almost all cases, these are people who have years of professional experience doing this, and we are strictly reflecting our opinions as players and appreciators of the game. If we didn't start from a position of very much enjoying Mage, quite simply, we wouldn't be doing this. M20 is a new edition, as all previous editions are. It makes claims about who it says the games are for and what its intentions are at the table, and I look forward to exploring where that goes and how it compares to previous editions. In terms of announcements, just a note, as we've mentioned, I believe, in previous episodes, for M20, these books are very large. We will not be doing our normal every other week publication schedule. It'll probably be closer to once every 4 weeks, roughly once a month. The M20 core is a big boy, and I feel comfortable saying that. So, for instance, one of the off-cycle episodes that we will be doing is a discussion of the Mage the Ascension Quickstart that was put out by CCP in 2008, and can you run Mage from it? I said previously that I would start a thread in our Discord, discord.me/Mage the podcast, saying, hey, what are some less time-intensive episodes that we could do that would still be engaging for fans? I've gotten a bunch of good submissions for that. If you have any thoughts, by all means, discord.me/Mage the podcast. Those are my only announcements.
Okay. Well, this book came out in 2014. It is titled 20th Anniversary Edition Mage, the Ascension Introductory Quickstart Rules and Adventure Hooks. I think of it as M20 Quickstart. 46 pages, so it is a quick start. The author is Satiros Brucato, but of course he is always getting feedback and contributions and help from a large number of professional Mage writers. And Terry, can you start us off with a walkthrough?
Sure. The quick start is kind of divided into two chapters. First is a basic one that explores mechanics, a little bit of setting, and a little bit of information on how to run it. And then finally, a kind of place chapter where you are given a bunch of sample characters, a bunch of sample antagonists, some information about a place, and they're told, like, okay, kids, go play. Writing a quick start for a game is remarkably hard. You need to dispense with as much of the game as you can without losing what one would argue is the essence, and some people say that is impossible. I did another show on Exalted, and one listener question was, what is the minimum viable Exalted? As in, how much can you get rid of and have it still be the game? And one host said, nothing. Anytime you get rid of something, you are getting further and further away from that core experience. So that is from a dev for another game line that has a very thick core rulebook. And some would argue that Mage is the same way. Is it still Mage if it doesn't have a detailed description of all of the crafts or information about the meta plot, or 100 pages on how effects should be built, or a much more encyclopedic listing of paradigms, practices, and instruments? Everyone will come to a different conclusion. So one of the questions I have while reading through is, can someone play from this? And right out of the gate, the text very much says what the game is going to be about, or at least what it wants the narrative about. And the opening line is, I tell you this, we are divinity. Reality is ours to bend, to subvert, to command. We have the power, all of us. And that is the opening line, more or less, of the 20th Anniversary Edition, followed by our art for the Mage, showing Dante, or at least a figure that very much looks like Dante, with the questing avatar symbol being produced from a printer. The quick start has to leave a lot out, and it goes into it pretty quickly. It tells us, what would you do if you had the power of a god? And I find it fascinating that the only time that the term demigod is used in Mage is to describe mages, as an indication of their power. Is this something that I think is necessarily delivered on? No. Are mages remarkably lame gods? Kind of, possibly, maybe. But it sets a very high bar for the capabilities of characters and their ability to influence the world around them. In terms of narrative scope, I do think the term makes sense, because the mages will often be the centers of world-shattering plots, as frequently happens in Mage games. So with that kind of established, it brings us on to what the theme and mood for Mage are going to be. And it says the theme is reality is flexible and at your command. And I like that. It starts from a position of power, and the mood is there is always hope. I find it important for Mage that whenever I'm introducing someone to the game, I always mention that to me, it's a little bit of an odd fit for the world of darkness, because of how important the theme of hope is in the game, the degree to which the characters have the ability to make a positive spin on the world, and also the degree to which the fundamental character that you play is kind of human, as opposed to the extreme transformational otherness of being a vampire or a wraith or a werewolf. Mages are more or less human, or at least that's always been my read of it. There is certainly an alienness that comes from the Ascension War and the difficulties in waging it, but it kind of starts from that premise. It then goes on to a section entitled The Game, and it says, hey, you're a 21st century miracle worker. You're often divided and factious. Sometimes your magic works on magic, faith, science, and insanity, and there is a shadowy Ascension War that the different factions are waging against each other. This section moves very quickly because it has to, again, because it's a quick start, and not a lot of terms are defined. For instance, it just says enlightened science and true magic, and eventually kind of describes one or two of those, but it moves very quickly. The Council of Nine Mystic Traditions, for instance, is described as an embattled fellowship of sorcerers, witches, unorthodox technicians, and other devotees of esoteric orders, bitter enemies of the technocratic union. They appear to have been losing the battle for reality. The Nefandi are listed as a subversive network of nihilistic corruptors. Existing on the fringes of the other factions, this group commands a terrifying degree of influence within the modern world of darkness. And I think those are pretty good 1 to 2 sentence descriptors of the factions. Likewise, the traditions each get something like a sentence. For instance, the one for the Dream Speakers, which are now listed as the Kavadi, are preservers and protectors of both the spirit ways and earthly cultures that have been looted, abandoned, and oppressed. These mystics mix timeless arts with postmodern insight and righteous anger. I think it's a great description of the Dream Speakers. If someone is like, hey, Terry, describe the Dream Speakers in under 30 words. So it moves. We get an introduction to the conventions as well as other unaligned groups. And one of the things that I noticed immediately is the degree to which it says, hey, the crafts and the orphans are no longer bit players. We are bringing those back out. It's something that I look forward to seeing how it gets expanded throughout the rest of 20th Anniversary Edition. It then has a quick section of characters and things they can do, saying what a Rite, the Awakened Avatar, is, the traits that your character will have. And immediately I noticed the fact that it doesn't actually describe any of the traits. This is the first point where it became apparent that you cannot play out of this. This is billed as a quick start, but to me it is more of a tutorial / quick reference. This is something that when I am playing a game, I feel comfortable having 2 copies of this at the table. That way, if a player needs to very quickly consult a very basic rule, it is there. And the text also emphasizes the notion of will, that your mage has the ability to change the world around them by exalting will with a capital W. This to me is interesting in that mage goes back and forth on the degree to which it considers itself expressly hermetic in the real world tradition of saying, to what extent is magic strictly a function of will versus any other number of ways of doing it, of it being extension of divinity or it being something where the universe is acting through you. You get a very fast introduction to focus, and it describes it as what does the mage believe equals paradigm. How does the mage turn belief into action equals practice. What does the mage use to do so? Instruments. All 3 combined, focus. So we have an immediate departure from previous editions where we were now breaking down the idea of focus into 3 parts. What you believe, the framework of that belief, and how it actually gets done. We then go on to the rules of the game. We get a quick overview of dice pools and how rolling the dice works. We get a quick reference to how botching works, the power of spending willpower, modifiers, and some very basic mechanics. And in a bunch of cases, for instance, these are not self-explanatory. For instance, the section on shields includes the standard 3/+1 for a trash can lid, indicating the number of dice that you would get to roll, or alternatively, the modifier for ranged attacks. Those are not explained here. You will need to know what that means, and you will need to go elsewhere. And this book, in a lot of cases, says, hey, this is not enough on its own. You need to go somewhere else. We then get to the section on the magic rules, and it does a thing that Mage has done in a few places, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. And it says, unlike the Wizards of Legends, modern mages cannot simply throw thunderbolts or turn people into frogs. I would argue they very much can. It is just a poor choice. So, like, when a kid's like, Mom, can I do blah, blah, and the parent's like, well, you can do blah, blah. As to whether or not that's a good idea, the answer is probably no. So it very quickly is like, you can't do this, but if you want to do this, this is how. And we get a basic dichotomy of coincidental versus vulgar. It establishes a pretty high ceiling for what technomagic can do in terms of mentioning the miracles of modern science. We get a quick reference on casting magic. We get a paradox backlash roll table, which to me is infuriatingly slightly different than the one that we ultimately get in the core rulebook. I did not realize this until someone pointed out and being like, hey, there are 3 different paradox backlash roll tables. Are they revisions of one another? I'm like, no, surely these 3 must be identical. And I'm like, oh, son of a gun, they're all a little bit different. So know that going in. We get a remarkable high-level overview of the spheres and what each rank does. We don't really get a detailed description, a la, for instance, the 1-page reference that we got in 2nd edition, or I guess that would be 1st edition if we're talking about the one that was in the Book of Shadows. We get a quick reference for correspondence, spirit, and time effects and determining their difficulty, and then a list of common effects and the spheres required for it. And the note that it says these are the minimum sphere requirements. There may be other ways of accomplishing it, but this is kind of the bare minimum, which I certainly appreciate being included there. And that kind of ends Chapter 1. It is not something that you can play out of directly, in my opinion. It is not a quick start. Like, this has Free RPG Day on the front of it, and generally when I pick up a copy on Free RPG Day or get it after the fact, you can more or less play out of it. It doesn't quite do that, but if you intend on going on and playing an actual game, it is terribly useful as a quick reference. If you don't have the storyteller screen, this has a remarkable number of charts in one very small place. And again, even though the publication itself is 49 pages or something like that, the rules portion really is pages 3 to 22. So in 9 pages front and back or so, you have a remarkable percentage of the rules. Adam, what did you think of Part 1?
I also fell into the habit of calling them Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, but actually they're just sections or parts. There are 2 places in the book where they have what I think of as a chapter header, but one is Quickstart and the other is Toll for the Trolls, which is the setting and kind of Quickstart setting. So looking at what I'm going to call Chapter 1, as a Mage fan coming into this, I had a different point of view from Terry, and that is I haven't read through Mage 20 yet. I have picked through parts of the rules sections just to kind of catch up with the discussions on Discord, but I haven't sat down and read cover to cover Mage 20. So this is my introduction to Mage 20, where I sat down and like really focused on, okay, Mage 20 separate from the other editions. What is this book telling me about it? I'm going to take this in. And I was just really glad to see Magic with a K is back. Not because of any philosophical reasons or nostalgia reasons. I just think it is so handy to someone reading a Mage book to see the K on the end. It's like, okay, this is Sphere Magic. This is not Vampire Magic. This is not Hedge Magic. This is not Werewolf Gifts. This is Sphere Magic. Okay, it's got a K on the end. It's just one of those tags that helps me get through these books quickly and easily. So I'm just glad to see it back, philosophical concerns aside. It gave multiple names for mage factions and game concepts. This is a 46-page quick start. This is for people who have never even heard of World of Darkness at all, and they pick it up. It's like, how about this? So we're dropping multiple names for both factions and game concepts on them right up front in the first 22 pages. I don't actually think that's a good idea, because there are going to be some people who just really don't know anything about Mage or World of Darkness. It's like, well, I'm going to call it Eidolon. Well, I'm going to call it Avatar. And it's like, okay. Mistakes are always going to creep into large projects, but here, Eidolon is the technocratic term for Avatar, but when you read the introduction for Mage 20, it says the genius is the technocratic term for Avatar. So Terry said that a game like this, one of the big questions is, it's a quick start, is this a viable game? And I agree that is something to look at, because it says in here, hey, you can play this game, it'll be fun. But one thing that I want to also call out is on the front of my copy, I bought this full retail and had it shipped to me, but it says on the front, Free RPG Day. And there's a little, icon that looks like a wax stamp from, the days of long ago. So this was put into hobby stores as a free giveaway on Free RPG Day, which is, one day out of every year. And so I think of that as an advertisement. It says, hey, you've never heard of World of Darkness, you've never heard of Mage, but we're going to give this to you for free. And if you like it, come buy the book. So it not only has to work as a standalone game, it also has to work as an advertisement. And so that gives me 2 different ways to approach this book and makes it interesting for me. Getting back to the particulars of Chapter 1, as a longtime Mage fan, I was really surprised to see that the game term focus and also paradigm have been redefined. That is something that I'm going to have to take some time to get used to. For the first 3 editions of the game, a focus is something you have or something you do to allow you to do your magic in the way that you were trained to do your magic. Like it could be a dance, it could be a wand you're holding in your hand. You get the idea if you've gotten this far into our Tomes of Magic series. But here, focus is redefined as the combination of belief which leads to practice, which leads to the use of instruments, which leads to magical effects being done. So that's something I've got to take in. And also paradigm. In the past, I always had the understanding that even though paradigm wasn't concretely defined, there was a rough understanding that this is your belief of where does your magic come from and how do people actually do their magic. And here, paradigm is complete outlook, complete worldview. It's your ethics, your goals in life, your magic. It's like the complete package of who you are and where you're going. And so that I think that counts as a different definition for the game term. And for me, when it talks on page 8 about what this new definition of focus is, for me, it was a little confusing. It was kind of hard to take it in. It's like, okay, I've got to figure out all my beliefs and how those are practiced and what instruments those are. And if I'm going to run the game, I've got to help shepherd each of my players through this large process of thinking out a whole lot of stuff before I can start running a game. So my thought was, okay, I hope they can give good examples of this in chapter 2, because this new understanding of focus is a lot to take in. This may be a little nitpicky, but to me it matters. On page 9 it says, quote, "A roll of 10 is always a success," end quote. Okay, what does this mean? According to the rules in this quick start, a roll of 9 is also always a success. So what are we getting at here? I think this is a holdover from parts that I remember in the rules sections of the first 3 editions of Mage, which launches a whole nother discussion. Won't get into that now. But the witnesses or no witnesses section makes mystic magic look like a bad idea. It actually makes the reader wonder, why would mystic magic still be around? It looks like it's just a boondoggle. It's something that slows you down and makes you look bad. There's like a description of, instead of waving a magic wand to attack someone, you punch them. And so someone reading this section was like, well, yeah, obviously I'm going to do that. But the thing here is, in Mage, you need to understand that the thing you do to conceal your magic, to make it coincidental, is not the same thing always as what you do to make the magic happen. So in that section where it says, oh, forces effect, I'm going to punch the guy. It's like, okay, was the punch the cover-up to make it look coincidental? Or was the punch the instrument that allowed you to do the forces effect? I think even in a brief description, this is worth talking about. The spheres info, instead of going into a good detailed explanation of these are the 9 spheres, these are what each level of each sphere can do, I agree that's too much for a quick start. But instead it gives a lot of specific examples of, you could do this effect, you could do this effect. I think that's kind of cool, but also it would be kind of irritating. Looking at this as a standalone game, I could probably run this game, but I don't think that would be a good idea. I think there would be frustration in it for me. And the reason I say that is, if I'm going to run this game, I've got to take those 22 pages of rules and really soak it in and really get up to speed with that and be ready to run a game on that for players. But when I'm doing this, I'm training my brain on how Mage works, and then I read the Mage 20 core book and it's all different. And I'm going to have to unlearn what I learned. And so that for me would cause frustration. So yeah, I could run this as a standalone game, but I don't want to actually try to do that for a group of people. Quintessence is pretty important to Mage. Even in 22 pages, it seems like a short paragraph would be helpful, but I didn't see it. I don't remember seeing that on my read-through. There are weapons in here. There's no bow and arrow. Okay, maybe that's a nitpick. Seems like something that'd be kind of fun to have in there. There's no explanation of what the skills are. There's no explanation of nature and demeanor, so people are going to turn to the character sheet, and it's like, awareness, how is that different from alertness? No, this game isn't really going to help you with that one. I guess that doesn't fit into a quick start, but again, if someone's going to run this game for people, it might be irritating. So, okay, that's my thoughts on the first section, or chapter 1, and I'm ready for the next section.
Section 2 is entitled Toll for the Trolls, and is the adventure portion of this quick start. We get a introduction to the Cabal, the Bridge Trolls, who are a group of gutter mages of varying capability. We get an introduction to kind of 6 of those, plus a familiar, plus a few other things. We get our first Kustos M20, and this is where my question was, okay, so we've been given a bunch of pages, and often with a very short explanation, you need something that is kind of an example to walk you through that. And these characters try to explain some of these things. And as Adam said, for instance, we do not get a definition of nature, demeanor, or essence. And I think it suffers for that. I think within a quick start, you do need at least a couple word description of each of the abilities at minimum, because that is also something to me that a new player will also need. So not only to be able to play this, but also if it's going to be used as a rules reference thereafter, I think it is useful. It is a group that does guerrilla busking in Seattle to make ends meet. I find this interesting when two members of the group have matter of at least two, which gets you gold. Also, a busking license in Seattle costs $30. It's not really that hard to get one. But again, it's a World of Darkness. It might be different. What was it? Benning Aerospace may have a reason to lock that down or something. I don't know. The characters are described as having wards and illusions that protect their place of staying. Immediately, as someone who's read through M20 a couple of times, I don't believe the characters have the dots to do that. Also, I don't believe that any of the focuses mentioned actually explain the paradigm portion. They do not explain where magic comes from, merely the tools they do and what their effects look like. I am somewhat fine with that. You do not need to bring in necessarily the whole framework, but to me, one of the critical things in Mage is to ask the question, so what does your character think is happening? And we don't really get a lot of information about this. The characters themselves are fine. They are... I don't know what this says, maybe because recently the number of children in my life has increased. Sometimes I see a character being described as 16 or 15 or 18. I'm like, you should be in school. You shouldn't be out there doing magic or something like that. And it kind of has me concerned as an adult. But we then get some descriptions for the accompanying creatures. One of the characters is a number of dogs. One of them has a familiar. We get information on totems and spirit entities. This was somewhat frustrating for me because it immediately says, hey, these are the things they can do. We're literally not going to describe them. So for instance, the spirits are given charms, but we are not given rules for any of those charms. I guess as part of a quick start, I could guess if a charm is stimulate craving or appear. I'm like, I can figure out what that does, but at least give me like a cost or something like that. It talks about how totems have the ability to bestow dice on efforts, but also come with some sort of ban or a taboo that prevents you from doing things. Okay. We don't really get any notion of what the Umbra is. We get some descriptions of some other characters that are in the setting, like generic street kids or generic thugs or what have you, as well as Ronald Big Ron Berrigan, the notional antagonist to the group, possibly. We then get some story hooks. Do I think to a storyteller this is a useful little toolbox? Yeah. I think it's perfectly fine, especially if you need a character to pick up and drop in. Do I feel that the bridge trolls would be useful as a group that the characters could run into? Yes, that would be fine by me. Would I necessarily hand the character sheets to a character? Possibly, but I would generally probably ask the players to come up with maybe other character concepts and being like, here are some characters you can choose from, reskin them as you desire, especially if the group is not interested in dealing with a kind of a gutter punk aesthetic. So again, this is fine. And then it ends with a character sheet. Adam, what did you think of the second half?
Let's see. I think a section like this in a quick start generally is supposed to serve two purposes. One is get a game going quickly, and the other is give examples of the rules discussed in the first section. My thinking is, yeah, this could help get a game running quickly, but as for examples of what was discussed in the first section, especially the magic rules, I don't think the examples were good enough to really help me lock on to those concepts that were hard for me in the first section as a new person coming in. For me, one of the issues here is if I was going to take this to my friends and say, hey, let's play this. I mean, in all honesty, my offline friends and my online friends would look at that and say, I don't want to play homeless people. It doesn't appeal to me. Just like if I was going to say, hey, let's do a courtroom drama, everybody's going to play lawyers. My friends would say, no, we don't want to play lawyers. We want to play something else. That makes it harder sell for me with the people that I know. Another thing, page 23 has a sidebar about where to get more information on what's really going on with homeless people and homeless communities. And yes, it is good to get that information and know more about what's happening in our own cities. But honestly, this is a quick start game. If you put in a sidebar saying, hey, if you want to be a storyteller and run this quick start, you got to go online and do some research. Then you can run this quick start. It's like, that's not a quick start. It should be more simple than that. You should either say, hey, whatever preconceptions you have about homeless people, yeah, just run with it and have a fun game. Or you can say, look, if homeless communities are important to me as an author, and I think that people might do it a disservice in their own games, then maybe I should switch over to a different sample setting. Page 26, I'm used to an avatar having one form. There is a character here whose avatar is different every time it comes to visit him. And so my thinking is, as a storyteller running this for a player, if their avatar looks different every time it comes, how do they recognize it as their avatar? That sounds like a hurdle to me. I think for a quick start, say, look, your avatar looks like this, and that's how you know when it's coming to visit you. The NPCs here are at really, really different power levels. In one sense, that makes them more interested and varied, but some of the children being watched over by the two older members of this group are so much more powerful than the older members in the group that I would wonder how that would actually play out. It does say in here that they have their arguments and their disagreements. It's like, okay, well, when you have a disagreement with a mage who's a teenager and a whole lot more powerful than you, how is that really going to go? I don't know. That's probably worth talking about. There is a sample character here, Chopper, a young woman who seems to be either a budding technocrat or a budding member of the Society of Ether. She does a lot of building computers, machines, cyborgs, crazy robots, whatever. Okay. She is not only very powerful and very knowledgeable, but she also is working with a lot of technology and living under a freeway overpass where there's no electricity at all. I don't think she's going to be happy with his lifestyle. To be even halfway believable, I think the Chopper character would go to the other members of her homeless group and say, there's no electricity here. I'm leaving. Goodbye. Nothing personal, but I need power. And also we have sample character Sabra. This is a 15-year-old who is cutting himself, actually physically cutting his skin with knives to make his magic happen. It's like, how are the other members of this homeless person family okay with this? When I see a 15-year-old cutting himself, it's like, no, I'm taking the knife away. I don't care what you're doing. I'm taking the knife away. It's like, you call me what you want. You're not going to cut yourself in front of me. You're 15. You want to cut yourself, you got to reach 18 first. Then we'll talk about giving you the knives back. But okay, I'm a parent of 3, and my personal experiences are bubbling up here. So
that's why we need to write a dad start for Mage the Ascension.
Okay, sorry, my own shortcomings are coming to the fore here. But anyways. Like Terry said, the spirit charms aren't written up. They're listed. The names of the spirit charms are here. And a lot of them sound very interesting. And so naturally, a budding storyteller is going to ask, well, what does that do? How does that work? And well, there's no description here. So I was like, you got to come up with that on your own. It's like, oh, okay, I guess I can, but it is kind of asking a lot of me. As a longtime Mage fan, I like the renewed focus on the Umbra. I just think that's really interesting. The different sample characters in this sample setting, they are having interactions with umbral entities, and it matters to their daily life. And I think that's really cool. I think that opens up a lot of possibilities for Mage. There was much less of an emphasis on that in Revised Edition. So coming out of Revised Edition, I'm pleased to see this re-emphasis. They mention a couple of times in this short sample setting, there is mention of the city spirit of Seattle. I think the city spirit of Seattle is a very cool idea, but this one is entirely too accessible. Cities are large places with a lot of people, a lot of geography, a lot going on. The spirit of that city is going to be majestic, mysterious, distant, if it even halfway works for me. If such a powerful spirit should not be that easy to have conversations with and get help from. You need to have more knowledge about it and work at it to even get its attention for it to work for me. I think that if I knew nothing about Mage and I picked up this book, I think this is too narrow a focus on the world of Mage to bring out a lot of the appealing and interesting aspects of it. This look at just orphans in just one city trying to get by daily life, street level, it's like, okay, I can see how this could appeal to a lot of people. But just if this is my introduction to Mage, I would probably look at this and say, I like more going on. I want to see more than this. But I will say, as an advertisement, I think this could work really, really well. And the reason I think that is because towards the end of the first section, there are examples of what you can do with magic. And even though there's not a lot of rules, I think this would appeal to a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people who like the idea of a role-playing game that is set in the modern day and lets them use mystic, magical, psionic kind of powers. I don't think that is a niche that's being really that well catered to. And so when they read through this and say, hey, this is a modern day setting, but some of these magical effects sound really cool, a game that can let me do that's got my attention. So I think as an advertisement, this could work really well. I think this could cause a lot of people to go online and say, hey, Mage 20, sell me that book. I'm ready for it now. So I'm going to give it a thumbs up as an advertisement. As a playable game, yeah, I think I could run this, but honestly, I think it would be frustrating, and it would be more frustrating when I get the game and then I have to untrain all the stuff I trained myself to be able to do. So I guess that's my summation of this quick start. And hey, thumbs up to the people who got it for free on RPG Day. I had to pay for the book and the shipping and wait for it to come. So wasn't free for me.
I like that you and I both did that. We're like, okay, free RPG Day, free introduction to Mage, free as a PDF. Let's go find a print copy that we have to pay shipping on. So that's that's where Adam and I are there.
Yeah, it's another part of the dad start. Yep.
Yep. I think we could really go far with that. A dad start. Just rename the show. So that is the quick start. We will talk about the full book in roughly a month. But in addition to that, Josh Heath and I did a Q&A on our year as Mage fans, where we talked about releases that came out during the year, what it's like been doing a bunch of shows during the course of the year. We got a bunch of questions that are like, hey, you and Adam did a lot of reading. Talk about the reading. And we're going to talk about the reading. So these are all the questions that we received that pertained to Tomes of Magic. And we're going to go through that Q&A portion now. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. And the first question we had is from Stephen Garten, who said, how does it feel to have finished Revised? Adam, how does it feel to finish Revised?
Feels great. It actually feels like an accomplishment. Now, of course, it's not an accomplishment you can brag about. Hey, I read a bunch of books. Yeah, so what? I read more.
I read good.
For me, it feels like an accomplishment. I sat down, I read these books. I was really paying attention to it. I was keeping notes in 3 different places, and I didn't realize how many books were in Revised Edition. There was a lot of authors putting a lot of effort into Revised Edition, and I can appreciate that now that I've actually taken the time to go through it and keep some decent notes. And I'm very glad that I kept these notes, because honestly, I don't have time to read all the Revised Edition again, but my notes are going to help me quickly get to specific pieces that I want to focus on in the future. And so it was time well spent. Really glad I did it.
Revised is, again, very roughly rounding off based on my count. It's about 3 million words, 2.8 million words out of the total about 7 million words that have existed for Mage. So it's a lot. To me, it's a relief. It's a big edition, and it shattered to me that the notion that our editions are one thing. As Adam and I were finishing up 2E, we had the conversation where we're like, well, 2E can really be divided into 3 parts. The portion of 2E that was actually 1E that was developing Satyros' vision, transitioning from Wick's vision, kind of the middle of that explaining the world, and then the lead up to Revised. And those to me were kind of all different sub-editions, for lack of a better term. And to me, Revised had even more of those. It had phases. I would say that there were 4 or 5 of them, and it was reading them next to each other made those different phases apparent. As we were reading, Adam and I were both sometimes frustrated by the inconsistency in tone and voice that occurred between that, where it's like, hey, the core rulebook says this, and then less than a year later it said this other thing. But to me, it very much shattered the notion that an edition is a thing. To me, Mage, it has very much cemented the idea that Mage is big and messy, and there's space for a lot of things in there. Next question, also from Stephen Carton. What do you feel was a unique innovation contribution from the Revised era?
For me, initiative rules and choosing how to spend successes for sphere effects was a big innovation in the rules, and not only does it make a big change, but I really liked these changes. I really want to work with them. Some people might think, oh, the initiative stat in Revised Edition was such a little thing, but no, I think it really matters. I think it makes a positive difference in the games, and I think that whatever edition I'm running, I'm going to pull that initiative in there. And the spending successes sphere effects, that is closely tied to a set of rules that are just in Revised Edition. But honestly, I don't think you have to lift out all the connected mechanics to make that work. Even with second edition, you can just say, look, I'm going to reduce the impact of the effect while increasing the duration, like basically move a success from one column to another. This is quick and easy to do. There are times when players want to do that, and I like giving them that choice. Revised Edition made me think about that, and I appreciate that. For the setting, my big ticket items are let's see, the Shallow Realms from Dead Magic 2, the Australia chapter. I
Yeah.
never thought of something like that, but after reading it, I knew it belonged in Mage. It just excited me. Also, I really like the Taftani and the Jinn. The Jinn are a different kind of Umbrood. I want to explore their origins and their relations to other Umbrood. So glad that was added.
For me, on the mechanic side, I really liked the rules for talismans and wonders. It is not something where I would necessarily take the creation rules. I think those were a little bit, but to be like, no, this is why a 3-point talisman is so powerful. It can do magic on its own. Yes, it consumes a point of willpower. It lets you have 2 actions in a turn. You can always get it back. It resonates with your essence. It can absorb paradox. It really made it feel way cooler than just magic item that we got in previous editions, where you're like, well, you can do a forces effect and turn anything into a flamethrower, or you can build a magical flamethrower. I'm like, why bother? And this really answered the question of the why. And the ones that we got in Forged by Dragon's Fire, I think, were interesting and evocative. Again, the creation rules, I think, were a little bit difficult. It requires a lot of tasks and a very long extended action, and it also costs a point of willpower, so it's hard to say why it would happen necessarily in game. But overall, the sheer explosion of item types and variants, just the idea that a sword could have dark fate, I'm just like, this is great. I love it. From a setting perspective, it made the world huge. It absolutely multiplied the number of groups in Mage. The fact that within the Akashi Yana, we got 2 additional subgroups, and each of them was composed of several houses. When I was working on Lore of the Traditions, I brought up the cross-tradition groups that were introduced in Guide to the Traditions, and someone's like, oh, I don't remember those. How many were there? Like 4 or 5? And I'm like, no, there were like 25 of them. Also, my co-host wrote up a convenient list of them if you were curious. So thanks, Adam. Also available in our show notes. And it just made the world rich and huge. So it made Mage more broken apart, but more populated. I do feel that Revised and a lot of its stuff was kind of overlooked in M20. And one of the things I'm excited about discussing M20 is to see what things from Revised were brought forward, what things weren't. Third question from Stefan Carton. Thanks, Stefan. When are you and Adam running a one-shot? No pressure, but Adam has a lot of great story ideas, and it could be interested to see those in short form. Adam, when are you going to do the 2-year-long series where you finally implement all of your plot hooks?
Wow, that's... Next question.
I added that last part. Stefan didn't ask that.
Well, let's see. Looking at this question, Terry already ran a one-shot. He can speak to that, but it sounded like people really loved that after that was done. So thanks, Terry, for doing that. And I'm sure there's more in the future. Terry's a real creative guy, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he does. Now, that gets, speaking for Adam, is like, yeah, I didn't run a one-shot. Yeah, it's true. I really have enjoyed writing the story ideas. I've even got a few more. No, I'm not going to drop them now. But the reason I haven't done that is because working through Tomes of Magic, reading the books takes a lot of time for me. I'm not as fast a reader as I would like to be. I'm keeping multiple sets of notes, and I'm raising 3 kids. And there's this woman in my house. She keeps telling me she's my wife and she deserves some of my time. I don't know what's going on there. But after I work that out and get through the Tomes of Magic series, then I will have more time to do these things. And also, before I run a one-shot, I need a little more confidence. I need to be running some games. And for me right now, that's actually difficult because I've got children in the house. My wife said, please don't invite people over to the house and run games at the dining room table. It's hard to get the kids to bed on time. It's like, yeah, okay, I get that. So I want to go play in the game stores. Well, I live in Austin, Texas, and I know it's different for different people, but in the city where I live, there are 2 or 3 nice big game stores. They're great places. But they have not allowed anyone to run games or even have meetings at their game tables, which they have many of, since March 2020. And here it is, we're starting 2022, and there's no change in that. I phoned up the game stores like, hey, can I run a game there? No, I'm sorry, we just can't do that. There are health concerns, and we're not doing that. So once I can run an actual game, get something under me, get some confidence, then yeah, I would love to do an online recorded one-shot or a couple of scenarios run together. I would even like to do a nostalgic first edition Technocracy sort of campaign. I think that would be a lot of fun, and I think I would bring a perspective to that may be a bit different than some of the other people who are hosting Mage the Podcast. But I just got to get Tomes of Magic finished, and I got to be able to run an actual game on my own.
One way of reading that question is, when are you and Adam going to play at a table together? And the answer to me is, it's not quite never, but that's one of those things where it's like you don't want two storytellers at one table. And I've run over the course of the last 2 years, I've run a lot of one-shots. And the thing that is hardest for me to deal with is when my table has another storyteller at it. And you can just feel the constant, well, that's not how I would do it. That's not how. I know Adam wouldn't do that to me. I can't say I wouldn't do that to Adam. I have very poor self-control about these things. But yeah, I would be super excited to see an Adam one-shot. And one of the things I've thought about is, what would it be like to do a series of actual plays or one-shots that were like kind of from different eras of Mage? There is a 1E Mage Storyteller Vault supplement out there that is like, okay, we're going to take the world of 1E and just kind of run with it. And I would be fascinated to see your 1E Technocracy game. So maybe eventually. TL Webb asks, what was the best revision between editions that improved the setting? The introductions of mortals as a primary antagonist. We get the first idea that the reason the world is kind of meh is because mortals have stopped caring. And on one end, that kind of apathy seeping into a game can make it less interesting. But mages as leaders of humanity and elements of dynamism and dealing with complacency that was created by a world that mages have controlled seemingly for so long, I think is an interesting place to be. The other thing that I think improved the setting was I really like the exploration of the Avatar, something weird and alien. That makes the game very interesting to me. I think mage games and the mages in it are a compromise between understanding and practicality. And I can't remember which book talked about systematic mages versus more practical ones. And I think all mages are going to kind of be a mix of the two. To some extent, each mage goes, this just works, where another one goes, but how? And the weird Avatar is one of those things where it's like, hey, there's this thing I'm dealing with that I don't fully understand, but it lets me do magic. Like, how much am I going to stare that gift horse in the mouth? And I think that's super fascinating. I know there are a number of people who don't like that weird Avatar. I think it's great. I think there's a big spectrum of play space that can exist in there where you're like, well, this is just a weird aspect of my personality. It is a glorified version of the fact that sometimes I get real jonesing for pickles. And other people are like, no, it should be a fully integrated part of the person, and any disunity between the two parts defeats the idea that a mage is fundamentally doing something by pushing their will and belief onto reality. I'm like, okay, not for me. Pukagar asks, what's the most important or engaging tidbit of lore that you learned or forgot or rediscovered over the course of reading the books for your reviews?
Well, the changes to the core concepts of the game in Revised Edition got my attention the most. I didn't like all of them, but I appreciate the fact that they made me think about the components of the game. In terms of lore, the Rogue Council was fascinating. Also, the Technocracy's internal conspiracies, the Friends of Courage and Project Invictus. Even for Chronicles that don't focus on Technocracy players, I find so many possibilities for these internal groups.
I was a big fan of getting detail on the Entelechy, the event that caused the creation of the Ali Bettini, and how that very nicely tied together the weird nature of Avatar shards and so on, and one of the options for how the end of the World of Darkness could occur. I think my favorite individual fact was probably in Tradition Book Euthanatos, where they talked about how the Euthanatoi were responsible. The Himalaya War was necessary as kind of this forge that resulted in the Euthanatoi, the Akashiana, and the Ali Bettine all coming out the other end. And in a slightly different thing, as Adam mentioned before, Shallowing Realms. I wish they were in M20. I think it is a big, beautiful, fun idea that I really think you could have a lot of fun with. It really answers the question of, this is a small group of mages. How do we give them something cool that is their own? And I think Shallowing Realms really answer that question. And I just wish that was one of the things that was brought forward. So total agreement with Adam on that one. Charles Siegel asks, after reading all the revised traditions and convention books, what faction do you think Snowflame, the supervillain powered by cocaine, should be? This is a reference to the fact that I have repeatedly said the two most powerful spheres in Mage the Ascension are the 10th sphere, the sphere of gun, and the minor sphere of cocaine. This came about because the rules for cocaine as listed, which is a stimulant drug, kids, don't do drugs, basically lets you do a paradox-free version of Time 3. You get extra actions, you do take bashing damage, and you need a little bit of time to recover, which on the whole is way less severe than Paradox. Just putting that out there. So to me, this question as asked, they're immortal. Like, pardon me. They are mortal. Like they're just a person. A coked up person with 2 handguns is capable of dropping some serious pain in Mage the Ascension. Mages do not soak lethal damage. This is why in almost every game of Mage I have ever played in, initiative is not something we roll because one person starts a fight with overwhelming force or the other person starts a fight with overwhelming force. And if you don't disable or kill them immediately, you use the sphere of driving away. Which is quite potent. It's the coincidental version of correspondence. So to me, a sorcerer with access to the path of alchemy or enchantment would be how I would min-max a mortal opponent. So Snowflame, the mortal alchemist with the 2 lesser known spheres, to me is clearly where that goes. And this may turn into a Storyteller Vault supplement. I'm not entirely sure. And our last questions, out of the many revised faction books you read, which one would you say is your favorite?
Let's see. I really liked what they did with the revised edition Dream Speaker trad book, but my favorite pick, Void Engineers.
Yeah.
So many cool ideas in there, and such a mature tone to how they were approaching it. It's like, yeah, that stands out as probably my favorite one.
I think for me, Void Engineers is also the same answer. It's the best. One of my initial jokes was like, hey, Adam, I listened to the audio from the Void Engineer episode, and it was just an hour and 43 minutes of us going, it's so good. Which I think happened with one of I can't remember what other book that was basically us doing that off the top of my head. But for me on the traditions.
That might have been Sons of Ether from first edition.
Yes, one Society, Sons of Ether, yeah. To me on the tradition side though, Order of Hermes, I think. It is the only tradition book that has no in-world dialogue or discussion. So it is done from an in-world perspective, but it is not amongst in-world characters. So they had to pack it in. So the sheer amount of material in it, we got house write-ups for all of the current houses. We got the cadet houses. We got the historical ones. That is where we got House Luxor and House Tharsis and so on. The history was actionable. The paradigm rundown was fascinating. The spheres were, the effects were interesting and evocative. And to a lesser extent, Celestial Chorus, when I think of books that are really early revised and that really embody that sense of listlessness and the Ascension War has passed and we all lost, what now? The Celestial Chorus just absolutely nails it. That is not a mood I like, but it did it very well, if that makes sense. In the same way that I'm not always a fan of horror, but when I see it, it is good to see it done well. So once again, as always, I have cheated. So those are the questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted it. It was super fun going through revised and onward into M20. Anything before we roll out?
Next book is the Mage 20 core book, and as I read it, I see my arm muscles getting larger. I'm going to be pumped at the end of reading this book.
It's a primer that grants 1 dot of strength, yes, or 1 dot of stamina instead of a dot of arete.
Well said.
Yeah.
Okay, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a positive review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in other people's searches, and we would certainly appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes that we prepare for you to go along with those episodes. This episode is thanks to executive producers
Alex, Anders S., Anon, Berto, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris P., Dan Svensson, Dennis Osborne, Elliot Osborne, Gargle Noir, George Lara, Guy Conan Stewart, LeBull, Isabella Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick Mulder, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Rob H., Ryan Hilton, Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and our Oracle level supporters, Buck Farmer, Christopher Phillips, and Jay Widener. All of you, thank you so much for your support, and helping all this stuff go out on time.
If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep bringing you episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. And until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go change reality. Bye. Failed progenitor Terry Robinson.
I always thought he used the syndicate guy.
Kind of. It moves around, and I find that interesting.
I don't know. Sometimes I daydream of like the fan-made low-budget Mage movie, and I think of like the syndicate villain plotting and saying something evil, and then he turns to Terry and says, "What do you think, Terry?" And Terry says, "Oh, yes."
I didn't have a witty outro for this. This is somewhat disarming, and I feel kind of discombobulated.